This has become a bit of a tradition, and fortunately one that Bill Nemitz has been willing to continue and humor us, coming here and sharing his thoughts about the election that has just passed. And always, I always find it, Bill, always amusing, but also brings interesting insights to views and ideas that he learns of around the state and that we may not have considered here in our meetings. I guess you could say he has a broader ear to the ground than we do in the course of the campaigns. So, Bill, if you would unmute yourself and say hi.
Hey, can everyone hear me?
Great. And
yes,
I hear you just fine, Bill.
Great.
Thank you. Bill Nemitz, a journalist for the Portland Press Herald.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chris. And as you are muddling through this, so will I. I again, thank you, and good evening to all of you. I told someone yesterday that I'd be speaking to you folks tonight, as I have several times in the past. And he said, hey, at least you don't have to drive this time. And while that may be true, I do wish that we could gather in person. And I certainly look forward, as I'm sure you do, to doing that again in the not too distant future. So here we are. It's over, despite what President Trump and Rudy Giuliani might want us to think. Donald Trump is finally out, and Joe Biden, whom I first began rooting for president way back in the late 1980s, is in. The Maine legislature remains solidly in the hands of the Democratic Party. And congratulations to you folks who helped make that happen, and to the candidates who ran in those races. Shelley Pingree and Jared Golden are going back to Washington. And there's talk of Angus King being tapped for Director of National Intelligence, National Intelligence, which may or may not happen. If it does happen, there's going to be one heck of a debate who should replace him. But before we look too far forward, I think it's important that we look back at the one election outcome that seemed so inevitable, so likely, until suddenly it wasn't. Many of us thought Susan Collins' days in Washington were numbered. Yet Collins, viewed as perhaps the most vulnerable Senate Republican in the 2020 election, didn't just squeak by Sarah Gideon. She won big, by 9%. Her 51% victory took ranked choice voting right off the table, and it defied the polls that all year long showed Gideon with a small but steady lead of 4 or 5%. It even belied internal polls, which the campaigns whispered to us off the record showed a dead heat, too close to call, they were all saying. So what happened? Lots of things, I think. But to me, one thing stands out. This race, unlike any other we've seen in modern Maine history, was hijacked. Not by one party or the other, although they certainly played major roles in the outcome. No, this race was hijacked by money, big money, bigger money than Maine has ever seen in a statewide election. At last count, the two candidates and their associated outside groups had poured $185 million into this race, which translates into an astonishing $175 for every registered voter in Maine. And by the time the final spending reports are tallied, that number could well rise above $200 million. By any standards, that's a ton of money. By Maine standards, it's astronomical. And it showed, from the wall-to-wall TV ads to the flood of social media messaging to the torrent of direct mail, it became apparent in the final weeks of the race that both sides had essentially run out of ways to spend money. Hence the Trump-Collins signs with the small print at the bottom saying they were paid for by the Maine Democratic Party, and the Vote Sarah Gideon, Defund the Police signs paid for by the Maine Republican Party. And beneath all of this, like a kid caught out in a downpour without an umbrella, stood the Maine voter. The experts have always said that you can't have enough money in a high stakes political race. I now say, with the benefit of hindsight, that you can. Speaker Gideon spent just over $142 for every vote cast in her favor. Collins spent just under $57 for each of her votes. If war chests were indeed the determining factor in who wins and who loses, this month's outcome wouldn't have been close. Sarah Gideon would have won walking away. So what happened? Well, the pollsters, without question, got it wrong. And I think they did that in two ways. First, they underestimated just how strong the support for Collins was in rural Maine. Just after the election, the Press Herald published a map showing how the race broke in each community. Red for Collins, blue for Gideon. And I'm sorry I can't show it to you here, but I can tell you it's a sea of red across virtually all of interior Maine, with the blue vote hugging most, but by no means all, of the coastline. But the fact that Collins won all those interior cities and towns wasn't the surprise. It was by how much she won that caught observers off guard. Dan Shea, the politics and government professor at Colby College, who oversaw one of the polls, put it this way to Maine public. He said, "We knew all along that she would dominate in rural areas of Maine, in the 2nd district and so forth. But she's not just winning some of those communities by 2 to 1. She's winning by 3 to 1, 4 to 1, and 5 to 1. The numbers," Shea said, "are overwhelming." And that wasn't all. As well as Collins overperformed in interior Maine, so did Gideon underperform in the places she won. Take South Portland, for example. Gideon won as expected with 10,001 votes, but Collins got just under 5,000, significantly more than expected. Or take Freeport, Sarah Gideon's hometown, where, no surprise, she won with just over 3,700 votes, or by just over 63%. Yet at the same time, Susan Collins racked up more than 2,100 votes in Freeport, or 37%. Now that sounds good for Gideon. The problem was it wasn't good enough to offset all those little Maine towns where Collins didn't just win, she crushed. In her hometown of Caribou, Collins walked away with 74% of the vote. Or you can take the tiny town of Moose River, just north of Jackman, where Susan Collins got 107 votes, while Sarah Gideon got 10. Two things appear to be at work here. In the rural communities, Collins was a known entity, a senator for 24 years who, as she's boasted more than once, knew rural Maine like the back of her hand. Sarah Gideon, on the other hand, despite the fact that she's lived in Maine for 16 years, was still a newcomer. She was from away. And the fact that she lives in a coastal tourist mecca like Freeport only enhanced the notion that she, as the 5th generation Mainers like to say, is not one of us. That message was driven home by Maine TV icon Bill Green, about whom I wrote just after the election, and whom many, including the New York Times and the Columbia Journalism Review, with whom I just spoke yesterday, to name just a couple, they credit Green, at least in part, for turning what should have been a close election on its head. In his final and most memorable ad, Bill Green called Gideon, quote, "a virtual unknown who will be at the bottom of the Senate in seniority." For them, this isn't even about Maine, Bill said, referring to the outside forces lined up behind Gideon. But for us, he said, it is. Now note the them versus us. For a guy like Green, who spent 40 plus years without being political, to suddenly appear out of retirement stumping for Susan Collins was, as a guy in the White House might say, huge. It undoubtedly cost Bill a few friends, but as I said in my column, it did give new meaning to the words Bill Green's Maine. So what happened in those coastal and urban communities where Gideon was supposed to win so resoundingly that should offset Collins' small town central and northern Maine base. We go back to Dan Shea, who deserves the Mea Culpa Award for talking about this stuff so soon after having the rug pulled out from under him on election day. Speaking for his poll at Colby, Shea explained to Maine public that prior to the election, they decided the best predictor for the Collins-Gideon race was who voters favored for president. In other words, the built-in assumption was that Biden voters would gravitate to Gideon, while Trump voters went to Collins. Thus, as Biden went in Maine, which he won by 9%, so perhaps with a smaller plurality would go Gideon. But the opposite happened. Collins won by 9%, not Gideon. And the reversal was powered by the ticket splitters, those voters who, rather than vote strictly by party, pick and choose their way down the ballot without regard to partisan leanings. They picked Biden, and then a lot of them picked Collins. Which brings us back to the money. As we media types fanned out in recent days trying to figure out why Mainers on both sides of the Collins-Gideon divide voted the way they did, the common motivating sentiment throughout the electorate was that there was just too much money. And by extension, there were too many negative attacks, too many of those ads showing the opponent in grainy black and white with facial expressions that are, shall we say, less than flattering, and too many half-truths, if not outright falsehoods. Anyone who watched or listened to all this stuff knew that each side gave as good as it got. But in the end, it was Gideon who paid the price for too much negativity. After the election, the New York Times visited Rumford, at Milltown, the birthplace of Ed Muskie, a one-time Democratic stronghold that in 2016 flipped for Donald Trump and stuck with him in this election. People there told the Times that they felt the campaign against Collins was too much about national politics. Trump, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and not enough about Maine. Again, we turn to Dan Shea at Colby, who told the Times that being a resident of a town like Rumford these past months was like, and I quote, being a local at Woodstock in 1969. When it first started, it was exciting and fun. But by the end, it was muddy and dirty. Thus, at the same time, Gideon's campaign and its allies were lambasting Collins for being in Trump's pocket, for kowtowing to McConnell and aligning herself with Big Pharma. Collins' side was depicting Gideon as a tax cheat and as a protector of an alleged child molester. And oh yes, she's from Rhode Island. One Democrat in Rumford, a high school principal, told the Times that he was so fed up with all the negativity that he refused to add a Gideon sign to those in his front yard supporting Joe Biden and Jared Golden. And when the time came to vote, he went with independent Lisa Savage. I don't think you could sit there and say this is a classy way to do this, he said of the entire Senate campaign. I don't think that's what Maine represents. He also said this, I don't think you need to tell us who Susan Collins is. We've seen her for 30 years. She's had a relationship that was before Trump, and it's going to last after Trump. So why didn't this anti-money backlash equally envelop Collins? Well, for all the money Collins spent hanging onto her seat, Gideon and her supporters did spend far more, by a 2-to-1 margin as of mid-October. If the perception is that there's too much money in a political race, the person with the deepest pockets is likely to raise the most eyebrows. But at the same time, there's what I call the familiarity factor. Election after election, I've long thought that when many people enter the voting booth or now fill out their ballot at the dining room table, the last thoughts on their mind aren't about health policy or international relations or even the economy for that matter. They think about the person. Do they like him or her or not? Is the candidate in their comfort zone or somewhere outside it? Do they know the person? And by that, I don't mean they necessarily met, but rather do they feel as if that candidate knows them? Lover, hater, or somewhere in between, Maine knows Susan Collins. Try as Sarah Gideon might have to achieve that familiarity with voters, I would submit that she fell short. She's young, intelligent, articulate, and certainly knows her way around the State House. But in the end, people didn't feel like they knew her. At the same time, they associated her with all that's wrong about Susan Collins rather than all that's right about Sarah Gideon. What simply, I think Gideon struggled to connect, something Susan Collins has been doing and doing quite well for the past quarter century. Now, by no means do I mean this as an endorsement of Susan Collins. I've long been critical of her on many of the same issues raised in the campaign. I should also note that when the Press Herald editorial board, of which I'm a member, endorsed Gideon, we based our rationale in part on the fact that Collins' reelection might well preserve a Republican majority in the Senate, but for too long has paralyzed this country with its obstinance and its rigid refusal to even look across the aisle, let alone reach across it. But for all our certainty that the time had come for Collins to go, we overlooked one important thing: Maine voters. While some of us marveled at the cash flowing into Maine, they recoiled from it. While the pollsters predicted that Collins' days were numbered, voters kept their thoughts to themselves and quietly filled out their ballots. And while we convinced ourselves that being from away doesn't have to be a big deal, witness Shelley Pingree from Minnesota, Angus King from Virginia, we failed to remember what a weapon it can truly be. There will always be money, there will always be negative campaigning, and there will always be xenophobia. But as we learned a couple of weeks ago, there can be too much of all of the above. It reminds me of my mother, God rest her soul, who used to say, "Everything in moderation, dear, everything in moderation." Now, I'm going to end soon, and I want to engage in some conversation with all of you. But before I do, I do want to end on a more upbeat note, and that is that when the votes are finally certified, according to Secretary of State Matt Dunlap, Maine will likely break its old record turnout of 73%, which already was among the highest in the nation. In fact, he says it may well exceed 75%. Think about that for a second. Despite a pandemic that for many made going to the polls out of the question, Maine powered on. Even better, while many predicted a catastrophe with mail-in ballots or understaffed polling places or even sabotage, the election went off without a hitch. Our poll workers, as they always do, but particularly this time, performed heroically. Our polls remained peaceful. Nobody cheated. In other words, our democracy remains strong. Our citizenry is more engaged than ever. And like it or not, Donald Trump, we have a new president. That, more than anything for me, is worth celebrating. So I thank you tonight for your attention. I congratulate all of you for all the work you did in this election. And my best wishes to all of you as we head into this difficult winter. And please, politics aside, let's all look out for one another. Let's all wear a mask. Let's all do what we need to do to stay safe. thanks again, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
So I have a couple of questions, probably three here. Paul Arsenault is asking how much the fact that Collins was slated to be chair of the Appropriations Committee was a factor in securing her seat.
Well, I would like to point something out on that, and I do fault those of us in the press for not pushing that line a little harder. Yes, she is next in line to chair the Senate Appropriations Committee, but as far as I know, the chairman is still Richard Shelby, and he is going to be chairman until 2022 at least, when he comes up for re-election if he so chooses. So as we look back on this, we were kind of hitting ourselves in the forehead the other day, thinking, that promise that she made went largely out unchallenged, in that she, at least from where we sat, Senator Collins implied that, come January, she's going to be chairing the Senate Appropriations Committee, and that's just not true. And if there was one of those, if we could rewind the clock kind of things, I would love to go back and at least ask her to clarify that, because I do think she left a lot of people with the wrong impression.
Quickly run through some other questions, and then we'll recognize Kelly Whitlock-Burton, who has a hand raised. But we have a question. What does this strong negative value placed on people from away say about the future for statewide office seekers in Maine?
That's a good question. I really thought, and maybe it's because I live, on the edge of the Portland bubble or whatever, that was something that was fading. And it certainly is down here in Cumberland and York County. I mean, most people are from away down here, and that's changing by the day. It's increasing by the day. But I think a lot of people haven't really been, I wrote about this after the election as well. And for many people, I was talking to Jim Melcher at the University of Maine at Farmington, and he made a very good point. He said, for most people, this is a kind of a good-natured thing. People poke at each other. I've lived in Maine for 43 years now, and I still get it. And when I get it, I laugh at it, and the other person laughs at it, and that's fine. But I think it does speak to something a little more visceral with some people. And I think when you are trying to play to people's fears and play to their anxieties, and this is something that you can see on a national level with immigration. One of the best ways to do that is to convince people that this or that person is not one of us, as I said earlier in my remarks. I think it requires constant pushback, and I think it requires that constant message that Maine needs people. Maine needs more people, not fewer. And the more we can encourage that, the more some of these people can kind of infiltrate their way up into northern Maine. Maybe the more people will realize that that's, while an opportunity for good-natured ribbing is not a disqualifier for either being in Maine or running for office in Maine.
There was an observation that Maine touts the importance of attracting outside investors and families, and yet Collins ran on Gideon xenophobia. And somewhat related to that, those attitudes about people from away. Mike Mishu was pure Maine, but was reflected by first district voters as non-educated or not smart enough. And that's part of the dichotomy that we face in statewide elections. You can't be who you are and not be viewed differently by the two different rural and non-rural communities. How do we address that?
Well, I think people need to once the pandemic is over, I think people need to travel more. That would help. I mean, I can't tell you how many people in my own newsroom, I'm embarrassed to say, who have worked here for years and have never been to Millinocket, let alone Presque Isle or Caribou or Fort Kent. And I just, I get on them about that because I think first and foremost, as journalists, I think within your first year, it should be required that you travel the whole state and that you spend some time in Piscataquis County and that you head way up north. Not enough people do that. And when they do, the people in southern Maine tend to just go up there for the vacation. And if they interact with one or two locals, great. But they're not really, they're really passing through. So I think, speaking as a southern Mainer, I think people down in this part of the state really need to get out more. And I think as they do, they'll not only enhance the Maine economy by spending some of the vacation dollars in Maine, but at the same time, again, with that personal contact that I described earlier, they will one by one help some folks in northern Maine set aside this myth that, we're all some kind of carpetbagging monsters down here. I would add one thing too, and that is that there's this perception, the farther north you go, that southern Maine is all urban, that it's all Portland, the northern part of York County. If I go a little bit west, I'm in Waterboro, I'm in Springvale, I'm in Acton, I'm in all these towns that really are not that different from other parts of rural Maine. So another big part of the problem is the broad brush with which we all paint. Yeah. And that is that, southern Maine is not just Portland. It's not just Biddeford. It's not just Brunswick. It's a lot of rural towns that look, act, and feel a lot like folks in other parts of the state do.
It's my sense that we have a great deal of discontentment because of the economic struggles and the feeling that opportunities are just not available to people. Yeah. And unless you're wealthier or in some way a part of what they would view as the elite, where the advantages lie. And I'm wondering how much we can actually accomplish. And I know it's going to be difficult with coming out of pandemic recession and all when we do, but how much we can accomplish on addressing the economic and social disadvantages that people feel burdened by today. Before we move on, it looks like the questions are winding down, although there's a couple of comments, a little discussion going on there. It isn't so much of a question for you. Stuck in my head are a couple of things that I'm wondering, Bill, whether we can find ways in the press to be telling more of the stories of people from different parts of Maine all over the place, so we kind of chip away at that feeling that folks from the other part of the state are different in some way. You're talking about the community's perception that they're all, suburbs in southern Maine, and in fact are very similar small towns in rural nature. How do we get those stories that seeing eye to eye from northern and southern Maine to happen and change that dynamic?
I've long been an advocate of getting away from, we have to cover the news, obviously, and there's a lot of news going on right now. So talk to any of my colleagues, not only at the Press Herald, but statewide, and they'll, to a man and woman, tell you how strapped they are just trying to, number one, keep up with the news, and number two, do it under circumstances that none of us ever dreamed we'd be doing. Your dining room table is your newsroom. So it's tough, but at the same time, I really think that longer term, it's important for those of us in the media. This is something I've tried to do over the years with my column, to look for opportunities to step away from that daily ebb and flow of the news and, just tell stories. Back years ago, I used to do a thing, and I actually thought about starting it up again late now in my career, where I'd take about 3 weeks, usually in the summer, which is usually the dog days, especially for a columnist. There's nothing to write about. Everybody's on vacation. And I would head up into northern Maine and spend 2 or 3 weeks just basically reading the local weekly papers and looking for those little nuggets, those little stories, in the papers that had, in my opinion, at least so much more potential, and then tracking those people down and telling those stories. Like a guy who once, I can't remember his name, who crashed his plane in his farm, in his hayfield out behind he built a plane and then he crashed it in the hayfield out behind his house, climbed down from the tree in which the plane was hanging, walked down to the house, got his tractor, pulled the plane out of the tree, towed it back to his barn, and then set about rebuilding it, and it just was one of those great stories of, grit and determination. And, those stories are timeless, and they're also universal in their appeal. And as we come out, particularly as we come out of the pandemic, I think it's important that we kind of flex those muscles again. And I would also add that it's really important that people think that we don't listen, but we do. And a lot of those stories originate with folks like you. And if you think, someone on your road or someone in your town is doing something particularly awesome and people should hear about it, for one, call me or email me, bnemitz@pressherald.com. I mean, I am always looking for stories like that. And I know there are a lot of other people out there who are too, because for most journalists, those are the stories that are the most fun to tell. I know we have our political reporters and we all get sucked into that, but there's nothing floats my boat more than a great human interest story that educates people, as you said, Chris, about our neighbors, about our fellow Mainers. And we don't do enough of that, and I wish we did. So, but please, if you have any of those stories, all of a sudden there's going to be all these columns from Lincoln County, but that's fine. That's fine. I'll spread them out. But I really do love those kind of stories.
Great, thank you.